Well, hey, Drew, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm glad to be here in dialogue with you.
Well, I appreciate you giving your time. I know that you are really busy right now. You're doing a lot of work with churches and in this whole race conversation, which has, I know you've been involved in this conversation for a very long time. You've been
Yeah.
a leader in this conversation. You've written two books around, these topics of social justice. What is it like for you to have been in this movement, in this conversation for so long, and then to watch it sort of explode into a national conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting, I guess, to say the
Yeah.
least. I've felt all different kind of ways. I mean, there's a part of me that's certainly excited that at
Uh-huh.
least some people are talking
Uh-huh.
because many have not been engaged and not been willing to engage for a very long time.
Yeah.
So that's good. But I mean, it's hard to not be a little skeptical about the depth of the
Hmm.
conversations, right? How
Hmm.
far are people going? Especially when, I don't know, you see people engaging and leading conversations and literally like they've never had the conversation before. So you wonder what exactly are they providing, their congregations in these moments. And so the
Uh-huh.
depth, the heart, the intent might be there, but they don't necessarily
Yes.
have the skills and the frameworks to actually articulate and give analysis to what's happening around us right now.
Well, let's dive into that conversation of intent versus ability, skill, because I'm observing the same thing, which is a lot of people who mean very well,
Yeah.
especially pastors, but even in general, moms. I mean, people, people on social media, brands, a lot of people who mean very well, and they care, um, and they want to enter the conversation. But as it relates to pastors, where are you seeing maybe some bungling of well intentions versus maybe jumping in a way that is not as helpful as maybe it is harmful?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most basic issue that I see is that people are still operating out of what I would call a white frame of defining racism, right? And
Uh-huh.
so they have a very thin definition of racism that's about
Hmm.
personal prejudice and
Yes.
hatred because of the color of one's skin or something like that,
Right.
right? But they are not necessarily helping their folks think about institutions,
Hmm.
policies, structures, the
Hmm.
way that we literally organize our society on a bigger
Right.
scale. And so they can talk about why it's bad to have personal prejudice against someone that
Hmm.
looks different than you, but they're not capable of describing the ways that maybe their own congregation has participated in geographic racism in terms of white flight, redlining, been beneficiaries, sending their
Hmm.
kids to some schools, and just a whole range of things that I think we've got to think more complex about these things, because the temptation in the church, I think, is to give really simplistic answers to complex
Hmm.
problems. And while it's nice to do a potluck or a pulpit swap after we
Hmm.
hear about the killing of more Black people,
Hmm.
that's not going to end white supremacy, right? And so we've got to
Right.
actually deal with the actual problems in the structures, institutions, policies that exist, and the ways that we participate and are complicit in them, I think are really important as well.
Yeah. One thing that I have been seeing a lot of is, like, and you kind of mentioned it, it's like a call for unity, a
Right,
call for we're going to march, but it's going
right,
to be a unity march, or we're
right.
going to have a unity Sunday, or you know, um, I, I don't know,
Yeah,
like
I know
a
what you mean.
Sunday where, a peace Sunday,
Right.
you know, and it's so tough because I know people really mean well. They have the best of intentions with these, but where does that unity march fall short of this moment?
Well, usually how this idea of unity is being described, it's unity at the expense of people's sufferings being actually addressed, right? And so
Right.
it's unity that really means uniformity. Let's
Uh-huh.
all come together and
Hmm.
let's have a common denomination, a denominator that can bring us together, and
Right.
so that we're all happy. But it has nothing to do with the actual injustices and being committed to these injustices. I remember times where I was this one time. So a bunch of white Christians, they're singing like civil rights songs, literally. And I was disgusted by the whole thing because I was like, there's no way any of these folks are actually committing to ongoing work. They're just enjoying the moment. It's kind of
Right.
sentimentality, right? But
Yeah.
it's nothing deeper than that. And it kind of feels like it's, I mean, maybe desecrating sounds too strong, but maybe desecrating literally these
Hmm.
traditions that have been passed on by people who were committed to doing the work.
Yeah.
And so a unity that means solidarity in
Hmm.
struggle, solidarity in working against the injustice, that's a kind of meaningful unity. And I think that all Christian unity should mean that if it's be united in Christ, who was the one who said he came for the least, last, and lost, right?
Yes.
Then we should be in solidarity with those who are most vulnerable in our communities. And Christian
Hmm.
unity should always mean that, but rarely does it seem to mean that in mainstream Christianity.
Yeah, I think, I was struggling with some of our local churches here. We're doing unity marches, and it's so hard because I know these churches, these are people who have not engaged in this conversation. They actually feel like they're taking a risk in engaging in the conversation. They feel like
Right.
they're doing something great, and so there's a part of me that's like, oh, I don't want to criticize, but at the same time, if we're having a unity march or a unity service and that march and service do not address systemic racism, violence against Black people, then what we're really doing is co-opting a movement and having a kumbaya moment
Right.
in a
Right.
movement that's really, this isn't a movement that is about, as you said, individual racism, although that's certainly a part of it. It's a movement addressing structures and systems. And, how, I mean, for people who maybe are watching right now and are like, I don't totally understand the difference between that, what's a 101 explanation of the difference between individual racism, which is I have stereotypes towards someone because of their, race, skin color, versus the structural or systemic stuff that needs to be addressed? I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things I often tell folks is, so like in Pennsylvania, I'll give a geographically based example, though this is a common story in other places as well, in some forms. Maybe it's a little bit different each place. But the example I give is how funding works in Pennsylvania. We already have a huge problem across the country in terms of how taxes from your home, right,
Mm-hmm.
basically
Mm-hmm.
funds public education in different regions. So that already, which most people around the world think that's just horrifying. Like, why would
Yeah.
you do that? But it's in a system that allows to perpetuate wealth and advantages
Yeah.
and pass that on and keep other people excluded, right? And so
Yeah.
it makes sense in our country why we do that. But on top of that problem, then in Pennsylvania, for a very long time, we didn't even have a fair funding formula from the state. So like the state provides about 35-40% of funding to the school district. And so for a long time, we didn't have a fair funding formula, and there was a really racist way in which these funds were being distributed, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
about anybody's personal intent at this point anymore.
Right.
It's been going on for decades, right?
Right.
And so what they found was that the more people of color in a school district, the more likely that they were going to be underfunded by the state. And the more white people in a school district, the more they're going to be overfunded by the state.
Mm-hmm.
So a few years ago, we finally got the state to adopt a fair funding formula. And it was really faith-based organizing that actually made that happen. But the state, what they did was they increased their budget by, I think it was like 8%, and put the new money through the 8% went through the fair funding formula, and the rest of the money stayed the same. So basically, I call it a confession of guilt more than it is actually trying to fix the problem, right?
Right.
And so now, I mean, these are systemic policy problems. This is not about people hating people because of the color of their skin. Like no one's even, it's automatic. So long as this policy doesn't get changed, the legislation doesn't get changed, this is going to continue to impact people all across the state. So in Harrisburg, where I live, 50% Black city, large Latinx community as well. Like we would get $30 million a year more if the fair funding formula was fully being used. It's significant. And this is a school that's been struggling year after year, usually a little behind budget. Literally, we got taken over by the state because it was failing the children, right? And so these are the kind of systemic structural issues. But we could look at mass incarceration, we could look at housing, we could look at healthcare, livable wages, all kinds of stuff, and see that there's systemic structural issues, policies that need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned the role of faith-based, activists and action in changing some of those things for Christians who want to be more involved in, maybe this deeper work. Um, what's a jumping off place? How do Christians get involved in a way that is really moving that needle forward?
Yeah, first I would say is that we've got to become students of the different
Hmm.
ways that there are different methods for
Yes.
social change, right, that are available
Yes.
to us. Um, I'm always shocked at mainstream conversations, even around things around like nonviolence, because
Hmm.
there's a perception that we've got to become more violent because this nonviolent stuff doesn't work.
Hmm.
Ironically, the interesting fact is that social scientists have shown the exact opposite, is that nonviolence is actually more effective than
Hmm.
violence resistance,
Hmm.
if it's sustained and strategic and
Yes.
active, right?
Hmm.
So, but the term nonviolence sometimes gets used just to replace talking about marches,
Right.
when really that's not strategic, right? That's when
Right.
all we're doing is marching and rally, marching, rally. There's nothing
Right.
strategic about that. Nonviolence is supposed to be strategic, usually
Hmm.
escalating
Right.
campaigns that and mobilizing, mass mobilization to get as many people to address it. And what they say is that all you need is 3.5% of the population, and like
Hmm.
these movements are like guaranteed pretty much to win if it's sustained and active, right?
Right.
And so anyway, that I think is just understanding nonviolence and how that works. I think is important work that we need to do,
Hmm.
but then also to understand the difference between like protest movements and organizing work, which both of them in some ways are nonviolent work, but they're
Hmm.
different goals and strategies. So churches can get engaged in either movement work, again, mobilizing, mass mobilizing as many people as possible, usually
Hmm.
without high levels of commitment, which means you can get more people involved usually, but
Yeah.
also they're not going to be sustained in the work usually, right?
Yes.
Organizing, on the other hand, is about power building on the ground at the grassroots level. So um, people are building one-on-one people in, letting the community hear, voice their own concerns,
Hmm.
identify the main things that they want to address, and organizing and building power, not from the top down, but bottom power, right? Um, Building local power and addressing very concrete issues one at a time, trying to
Hmm.
go to the power brokers and address those issues, usually a little more through formal channels than maybe movement work does. But all of those things are actually options that I think are available for congregations to engage in. Usually what I tell people though, especially for faith-based organizing, like figure out who's doing the work already in the community, right?
Yes.
There's always a
Yes.
danger, and not only white churches, but especially white churches, right, with the
Yes.
savior complex, to
Oh,
just want
for
to
sure.
reduplicate the wheel. And I
Right.
think that we've got to figure out who's already doing this work. How do people, especially if you haven't been doing the work, how do you learn to follow and spend some good time just joining in and following orders, and put some elbow grease in before you start making suggestions about what needs to be done.
Yes. Yes. And listening and making sure that, the organizations you are putting your weight behind have Black leadership and are not just, as you mentioned, like an attempt at, sort of a white savior, we're going to come in and
Right,
help
swoop in,
everyone,
save the
swoop in.
day.
Yeah.
Right.
I think a lot of people might be really surprised, unfortunately, surprised to know how many organizations are out there. I think for a lot of white Christians who are just being introduced, or white people in general, who are just being introduced to this movement, they may be looking at it and going, okay, so I can either join Black Lives Matter, the organization, or like they might think that's the only option. And then there's, lots of Christian propaganda, unfortunately, going around about like white, Black Lives Matter is Marxist, or they're,
Right.
they're not pro-life, or they're LGBTQ affirming. And therefore we can't do that. And I think people may not understand how many faith-based organizations there are available for people to get behind if that organization is not one that they're comfortable with.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I would say a big one that I really want to push on a national level, there's an organization called Faith in Action. It used to
Mm-hmm.
be called PICO. Now it's Faith in Action. And they actually are an umbrella organization, which a lot of other faith-based organizations kind of work with under them in different places. So
Yeah.
under Faith in Action, like here in Pennsylvania, we have Power Interfaith, right? And so I've done some work with Power Interfaith. I know some of the leaders in Faith in Action, but like on a local level, it's Power that I've been engaging in. And so, yeah, people can figure out who are those organizers. And there's lots of others. And there are some other big umbrella organizations as well that people collaborate with. So people got to do some homework, right? Do some research and figure out who's there. I would say, though, that no matter what, if we're really committed to our community, we're going to have to be comfortable partnering and collaborating with a whole variety of people, regardless of whether they match up 100% with our ideology, our faith, whatever, right?
That's right.
And so we can collaborate at points of interest and agreements, and also learn from folks, right? I mean, I've learned so much from my Muslim brothers and sisters who I collaborate with all the time. I appreciate them. I'm glad that they're there. And so there's an actually really meaningful way in which exchange can happen in those spaces, and we can be inspired and encouraged with one another. And that's without me diminishing I show up fully as a follower of Jesus everywhere I go. Everyone knows who I am. I don't have this, sometimes there's this perceptions, right, that you have to like erase who you are in these spaces. No, you show up fully as you are. But also allow other people to be fully who they are as well. And we can collaborate. And I think that's precisely when we understand what it means to pursue the common good, where everyone can flourish out of that situation.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we as Christians, we have figured out a way to partner with other Christians who hold very different theological views. We can, as Protestants and Catholics, get together, even though we have very different theologies on, Mary, and we can get together with people who are premillennial or postmillennial, like they're, or who believe in water baptism or don't. Like Christians are able to partner with people that they disagree with theologically, but yet there seems to be this real block when it comes to LGBT or, and so I agree completely that I think if we're really committed to this work, there are times that we have to just partner with people who we don't agree with theologically, because we do that all the time.
Right.
We really do that all the time.
And the fact of the matter is, we're talking about our neighbors, our community. Like these are people that, so it's only like somehow we've segmented in our minds that only in matters of faith, then somehow we have nothing to do with anybody else. But then we interact with people all the time. Hopefully you do, right? Hopefully we all interact with folks. But some people, maybe they're not, right? I don't know. But I think, what does it mean to be fully human, the way that God desires for us to be, and to see our shared humanity with everyone? It's not just shared humanity with followers of Jesus, shared humanity with everyone, because we're all made in the image of God. We all have dignity because of that. We're all worthy and valuable. And
Absolutely.
Some of what we learned from the Black Lives Matter movement is precisely that, right? That we need to value everybody, see their worth, recognize their dignity, and treat people as such.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, ultimately, I think a lot of the philosophies of the Black Lives Matter movement that are speaking to that are being twisted and bastardized by Christians as some like anti-family, when really what they're saying is we affirm familial differences, or we affirm non-traditional households.
Exactly.
They're all included, we're taking a village approach. And I think there's a whole lot of twisting.
A lot of twisting. I was just having a conversation the other day. Somebody was saying that, they're cultural Marxists, right? I'm like, what, I mean, how do we even respond to these generic statements? I'm like, look, as someone like, I don't identify as Marxist. Though, to be fair, like I have some really good friends who do, Black Marxists. And honestly, they're some of the most genuine people I know, right?
Sure.
But I haven't read Marx. I don't get my inspiration from Marx. Yeah. But if I'm going to make a critique about something, then be specific about what we mean by that. Because when we just make these blanket statements, it's almost like McCarthyism. Oh, he's a commie, right? And that's what it creates, that kind of fear, and it allows people to have a justification to deflect and deter and not take anyone seriously. No, be very specific. So is it like, are we worried about Marxism in terms of like the narrative, an ideological narrative that maybe is incompatible with how we understand ourselves as Christians? Sure, all right, we can have that conversation. But like if it's because there's a power analysis or because the economic critique, like have you read the Gospel of Luke? Like that's what I want to know to folks, right? Like Jesus has a devastating economic critique and class consciousness that makes me uncomfortable. And I think I can be kind of radical at times, but I read the Gospel of Luke, I'm like, oh damn, is he talking about me? Like, And so I think that there's just something strange about the way that we make these comments, but it's a way of dismissing and not taking
Yeah.
folks seriously. And that means that too many Christians are not dialoguing in good faith.
I completely agree. I think that that's exactly it. It's not dialoguing in good faith. It's picking a word that sounds scary and then dismissing the whole thing without any engagement, without really asking any questions. And, if people wanted to dial into a study of Marxism and what that really means, I think that there are a whole lot of scriptures that
Right.
might look a little Marxist, if we're being honest.
Right. I mean, I always joke. In fact, in my new book, I have a chapter on like economics and the racial wealth gap in particular, but I start off, at least a portion of it, I have like quoting early Christians because they're devastating. I mean, they're like, if you've got more and someone else hasn't eaten, like you've stolen from the poor. And so like they very radical critique that is not compatible with capitalism as we understand it. And so I think that we don't need Marx to get there to make these kind of critiques. But if somebody engages, I mean, from what I understand is Marx, even people who don't just wholesale internalize all of Marx, is that he's helpful in a lot of different ways, even if you disagree with him on some things. And I think that's how we ought to read everyone critically and carefully. And so no different with Marx. Let's be serious dialoguers if we're going to be naming him, right? If I'm going to name Marx, then I better have read Marx first before I start criticizing and call people Marxists as a reason to dismiss them.
And I think, I think it's one quote from one of the leaders that's been taken massively out of context, which is that they were trained in some of the ideology, and some of the ideology is about social reform, and that's ultimately what's, where they're being informed is that social reform and critiquing social structures and critiquing wealth inequality and all that kind of stuff.
Right. I mean,
we should all be doing.
We should all have a problem with massive poverty and inequality and who has access. And I mean, we can come up with maybe different answers exactly how to address these things. But if we're not concerned with these things at all, then I would say there's something domesticated about our understanding of Jesus that we have to take seriously.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned your book, and that new book is Who Will Be a Witness?
Yeah, Who Will Be a Witness, and then the subtitle, Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. Yeah,
and that is a great book for people who, that we're talking about, maybe Christians who are saying, like, I want to get more involved in this, but I don't even really understand it at all. That's a really good book. And then your previous book, Trouble I've Seen, was more focused on the church.
Yeah. In some ways, they both are targeting the church, right? The first one is like anti-racism. What does it mean for us to understand what white supremacy, racial hierarchy is all about? How does it function systemically? How do we think about it as followers of Jesus, right? Kind of anti-racist discipleship. And then the next one like launches from there to say, what does it mean to awaken to our moments and actually get involved in this change? And in fact, some of the reason why I wrote it was, so I'm like talking to churches and congregations, and I got mostly really good responses from the book, but sometimes they would say like, all right, so you're calling us to do justice, what does that mean? What does that look like? And I'm thinking like, okay, maybe we need to back it up a little bit.
We need the handbook.
Right? and help them. And I ended up not doing like a handbook. In fact, most of it is still, I only get to the very practical stuff at the end of the book. And I really frame radical discipleship because I think we have such a domesticated understanding of Jesus. It's so domesticated and watered down and diluted. And so
I agree.
I actually spend 2 chapters trying to help us see Jesus, right? But then do some history on the history of Christendom and colonialism, white supremacy, do some stuff in terms of the internal life of the church and its worship life and how it relates to justice. And then I turn more externally in terms of nonviolent stuff, getting much deeper into some of the stuff that we began to talk about earlier, organizing, movement theory, electoral politics, a whole bunch of stuff. So that way people know what they're getting into, have some language and frameworks to enter into this work, and also to discern what will be helpful for their own congregations. So it's not me giving them answers per se, but just kind of laying out the field, I guess, so to speak.
Well, and the theology too, which is great. I mean, you're
absolutely,
you're really laying a foundation for people to understand. And I think, I think so much of this ultimately comes down to us taking that deeper look at Jesus, taking that deeper look at not just what we've been raised with and the stories and narratives that we were raised with in the American church, but like, what was this guy really about? You
Right.
know, what was he
Right.
really preaching outside of what we know from our church experience? And it is pretty radical.
It's very radical. I mean, I tell people, man, sit with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John
Yeah.
and take those seriously.
Yeah.
You can't really come out status quo. Like, I don't
Yeah.
understand. It's so interesting that, in fact, this is one of the things I argue in the second, like, somehow the church has like made Jesus into like a mascot for the status quo.
Yeah.
Like, that's really what he's become for the whitened Jesus, right? Has become that. And it's actually, on one hand, like, it's kind of impressive, like how you get from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to like a status quo Jesus. Like,
right.
It's actually impressive. There's some like quick sleight of hand stuff happening to get to where we are, but now it's just taken for granted, right?
Yeah.
That Jesus is this kind of sweet, docile, staring up at the sky with his hair flowing down, and, you know, like, that's the image that we have of him, and we've got to do something about how we've colonized Jesus. Literally, it's not only that people have been colonized. Literally, Jesus went through a colonization process in the West, and we've got to grapple with that.
Yeah. It's funny. I talk about that in my own book, where I kind of went through this process of really getting a better understanding of Jesus. And some of it was through my involvement with Red Letter Christians, which is, I think, where you and I ended up meeting. And it's like, the more I understood Jesus, who I feel that the Bible presents him as, the more I was offensive to my Christian friends.
Right.
Like, they felt like I was like on some slippery slope. And I was like, dude, I'm
Jesus.
I'm following, like, I actually understand Jesus more. Right. I feel like I'm more in tune with Jesus, and you guys feel like I'm on a slippery slope because I don't know.
Right.
It's wild.
No, it makes sense. And so for me, like, one thing which I always take as a compliment is people, when they have read Trouble I've Seen, have said, you know, I feel like I've walked away with a better understanding of Jesus.
Yeah.
Just as much
that
as,
is a compliment.
You know, understanding racism and white supremacy and having a language for all of that now. Like, they feel like they see Jesus more. And I feel like that's part of the work that I want to do. And
absolutely,
to help people, because his image, it's just been so distorted, so vandalized. The image of Jesus has been so vandalized in our society. Yeah. And we've got a lot of work to do if we're going to repair that.
Well, even when you think about the fact that there are so many white churches for whom they're just now dipping their toes into the conversation around race, and they feel like it's a big risk to do so with a congregation of Christians. Right. Like, how far have we gotten away from Jesus when it's risky for a pastor to speak about racism to a group of Christians?
Yeah, something has gone terribly wrong.
We've
gone way off the rails by that point.
Yeah.
And so it should be a wake-up call. Again, and I'm glad that some people are, and some people seem to at least be willing to go even deeper. I'm not sure everyone's there, but I'll take whatever we can get. You're late to the party, but come on in anyway, right?
Yeah.
Right.
What advice do you have for white pastors who are feeling overwhelmed, feeling like, I don't even know where to start, maybe recognizing that they haven't done the work yet, that they don't actually have connections with any Black leadership? That pastor who goes on Sunday morning, I got to talk about race, and I don't even know who to talk to, who to ask, where to go, or what to say. Do you have any advice for those guys? Because I think that's a lot of white pastors right now.
Well, I mean, I think the very first thing is good to name that, right? It's actually something meaningful to say, I don't have what it takes to pass this on. Because the fact of the matter is most white Christian communities don't have a tradition for doing this work. I'm going to tell you a story that'll get into this a little bit. So when I first moved back to Harrisburg from Philly to teach at Messiah University, I was invited to speak at this local congregation who was reading my book. And so went, talked to them, everything went well. And one of the things I mentioned was one of my friends, my colleague, leads this civil rights bus tour, 9-day bus tour. Excellent is what they do. I mean, in fact, that's where I first met Reverend C.T. Vivian, was in that context, as well as many other folks who are still living. And anyway, so I recommend it. They end up taking me up on this. So they go on this bus tour with another church because they were all white. They wanted to invite another church with them. So afterwards, like a year later, they invite my colleague to go and speak at the church. And they're showing the music, churches they got the sentimental music going and the pictures and all that stuff as they're showing the slides. And that ends. And right before my friend is about to go up and preach, an older white gentleman yells out, "Why can't we just get over it?" Right? Just like yells it out into the space. And it's just wild. And so, he's literally like right about to preach, and that's the atmosphere that he's about to enter into. The lead pastor tries to smooth it over, but you can't undo that. It's in the air now.
Can't put that genie back in the bottle.
That's not coming back. And then he goes up and speaks. Anyway, so I tell a story because I always like joking about what would I do if I was in that space? Because I think I love moments like these because I think they're like teachable moments. So I always, in my mind, my troubled, subversive mind, I'm thinking about what would I say or do in that moment. So I'd say maybe I would open up a conversation, right, with the guy. Yeah. And maybe I want to ask him some questions because I don't want to assume anything about his life. You know, maybe it's possible that, he had been living his whole life. He'd been doing so much anti-racism work his whole entire life, committed to racial justice. And so now he's like, all right, it's time to get over this. I've been so committed to it. I think we're done. Or maybe he came from a long legacy of people. His folks were all marching with Dr. King in the civil rights. Maybe his great-great-grandfather was the abolitionist against slavery. Maybe he's just this long legacy. Everybody had been so faithful, challenging the racism in society. And so now he's like, we can get over it. Maybe his whole community, everybody around him, was just, just doing the anti-racism work, committed to racial justice. And now he's like, all right, guys, we're done. Let's get over it, right? And of course I joke and say, the fact of the matter is none of that is even slightly likely, right? Yeah,
that's all very generous.
It's very generous, right? Because the reality is, and most people understand this, is that they, in their own personal lives, haven't been doing the work. Their families, they haven't been passing that on. Their communities have not been doing the work. And so the real question isn't, how do we get over it? How do we get on it for the first time, right? And so for pastors that want to actually engage, they need to name that, identify the failure. That they have not engaged in this work and say, how do we get on this for the first time? And we don't have the tools to get there. What traditions and communities have been doing this work, right? Absolutely. Clearly, one of the easiest spaces is the Black church, and particularly the prophetic wing of the Black church, right? That this work has been going on for generations. And so there's resources to draw from, there's leaders to learn from. And maybe these white pastors need a Black mentor, right? Yes. And stop seeing themselves as having everything to give and teachers, but as students and having something to receive and to learn from. And so I think that those postures where the first are last and the last are first are really important for these moments. And then, read widely. I mean, I wrote Trouble I've Seen, and other folks have written lots of resources like this precisely for folks to engage and to go deeper and to begin to understand. And you can pay folks, right? Also to
I was just about to say that though, too, because I think, I think there's this assumption of well, I'll just grab, the Black pastor I know and tax him to educate me. And I think that white churches who recognize that they have not been engaged at this level need to put some budget forward.
Put it in the budget. That's right.
Put it in the budget and pay for that mentorship and pay for that education because, Black people are a minority and they're taxed and tired right now. Right. Right. I mean, you guys are being stretched thin by everyone, everyone wanting your expertise suddenly.
Yeah. Everyone. Right. And so I was paid recently for a group in Boise, Idaho. And I was learning that, so they don't have a large Black population there. And so there's this Black pastor that everybody is just calling on, everybody. But he wasn't doing this work prior. And so he wasn't even sure, how to, so I told him, I was like, look, you got to set a fee. You can't, because there's something unhealthy about the relationship if they just expect you to just be serving them all the time. And not recognizing that you're bringing expertise to the table and that you have limited time. And that you got your own issues, right?
Your own job, your own.
Right, you got your own job. He's a pastor himself. He's got all that stuff that he's got to work through. And so So yeah, I mean, I'm always very clear with folks that that if you want me to come and do anti-racism training or racial justice training or whatever, you're going to pay me for my time.
Absolutely.
And I think that, yeah, as you said, they got to put in the budget. They got to show that it actually matters, right?
Yeah.
And usually the church's budget is a reflection of what actually matters to a congregation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of white churches need to also take a look at their staff and,
Yeah,
make sure their staff is reflective of the community at large, because I just think that that often doesn't happen either, way too
right,
often.
right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. I'm going to link your books up in the
Yeah.
caption, but where can people find you online?
Yeah, you can find me. I'm on Twitter. So my handle is DRUHART, Drew Hart. Same thing for Instagram. I have a Facebook page. I'm a co-host for the Inverse podcast. Not everyone knows that yet because I joined Jared McKenna for the Inverse podcast for this season 3. So I've been doing that. That's been a lot of fun. And let me think. And my website is drewgihart.com. And yeah, so you can find me those spaces.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you talking with me about all this today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kristen. This has been good.